My name is Simone Ardell Beaumont. I am 41 years old, and I want to tell you about the afternoon I sat in the office of a probate attorney named Donald Kessler on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Cincinnati, Ohio, and listened to him read my parents' will out loud, while my sister Diane sat 2 feet away from me in a gray upholstered chair and did not look at me once. Not when he read out the address of the house on Fenwick Drive that my father had paid off in 2003. Not when he read out the brokerage account number, attached to $318,000 in mutual funds my mother had been quietly building since 1991. Not when he read out the 2019 Volvo, the jewelry collection, the antique secretary desk that had been in our grandmother's house before it was in ours, the china that only came out at Christmas. Not once. She stared at a spot just above Donald Kessler's left shoulder and kept very, very still, the way a person keeps still when they are trying not to show you something. Everything went to Diane Beaumont Holt. Every cent, every square foot, every teacup. The will named me once, at the very end, in a clause that said, "To our daughter Simone Ardell Beaumont, we leave the sum of $2,000, Beau 2000, with gratitude for her years of independence. Gratitude for my years of independence." I have turned that sentence over in my hands so many times since then that it has gone smooth, like a river stone, like something that no longer has any sharp edges left to cut me with. It took me a long time to get there, but I want to tell you about the whole of it, from the beginning, because the beginning is the only place where any of it makes any sense. And because the ending, the thing my sister has never known and my parents died without ever discovering, is worth the whole length of the story. Before I get into any of it, I need you to do something for me. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you are watching this. What city, what state, what time. I mean it. I want to picture exactly where you are sitting right now. I am in Columbus, Ohio. It is a Wednesday evening in September, and there is a thunderstorm moving in from the west that is rattling my office windows in a way that feels, tonight, like the right weather for this particular story. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, in a 4-bedroom colonial on Fenwick Drive in the Madeira neighborhood, which is the kind of Cincinnati suburb where the yards are kept and the cars are new, and everyone goes to the same church they've gone to since their parents were children. My father, Raymond Beaumont, was 73 years old when he died in the spring of 2021. He had worked for 34 years as a regional sales director for a medical supply company called MedTech Ohio, and he retired in 2014 with a pension and a plaque and a handshake from a VP he'd never particularly liked. My mother, Gloria Beaumont, was 70 when she died 14 months after my father, in July of 2022, of a heart attack so sudden that there was no warning, no hospital, no chance to say anything. She was in the kitchen, she was making coffee, she was here, and then she wasn't. My sister Diane came into the world in 1977. I came in 1983, 6 years behind her. A surprise, my mother always said, with a smile that never quite clarified whether the surprise had been a welcome one. Diane was, from the beginning, the daughter my parents had designed in their minds before they had any daughters at all. She was neat, she was social. She brought home the right friends and the right grades and, eventually, the right husband, a periodontist named Curtis Holt, who had gone to Ohio State on a full academic scholarship and drove a very clean Audi and had never in his life forgotten a birthday. They lived 4 miles from my parents' house. They had dinner with my parents every Sunday. For 20 years they ate pot roast at that same kitchen table every single week, and I do not believe my father ever once noticed that I was not there. I was not neat. I was not social in any way my parents recognized as social. I was the child who read at the dinner table until my mother removed the book and set it on the counter, who spent entire summers in the public library on Kenwood Road, working through science fiction novels and National Geographic magazines, and anything else with a fact in it, who got into the Ohio State University on a merit scholarship in 2001 and then quietly switched her major from pre-law, which my father had assumed was happening, to environmental engineering, which he did not consider a real profession in any way he was comfortable saying out loud. Engineers build bridges, my father told me at Thanksgiving, in 2003, when I was home for the holiday and had just told him I'd declared my major officially. What exactly are you going to engineer? Water systems, I said. Remediation, cleaning up contaminated sites. He looked at me the way he sometimes looked at crossword puzzle clues he wasn't going to bother working out. Is that a government job? It can be. Or private consulting. He nodded once, slowly, and then he turned to Diane and asked her how Curtis's new practice was coming along. And that was the last time my father ever asked me a direct question about my career. My mother was softer about it, which in some ways was harder to bear. My mother loved me the way you love something you're not quite sure what to do with, carefully, from a slight distance, with a kind of anxious tenderness that never quite relaxed into ease. She sent me cards on my birthday that always arrived 2 days late and always said something like, "So proud of the woman you're becoming," which managed to be loving and vague at the same time, never specific, never naming anything real about me that she had actually looked at and seen. The person who saw me was my grandmother, Loretta Sims. She was my mother's mother, and she lived in a small craftsman house on Orchard Street in Loveland, Ohio, 30 minutes northeast of Cincinnati, in a house that always smelled like cedar chips and coffee cake, and the specific brand of hand lotion she had been buying since 1970. Loretta Sims was a retired bookkeeper. She had worked for 27 years in the accounting department of a regional grocery chain called Thriftway, and she had then spent an additional 12 years running the books for her own church, Victory Baptist on Montgomery Road, out of loyalty, and because she genuinely liked knowing where every dollar was going. She was a woman who understood numbers the way some people understand music, intuitively, structurally. She could look at a column of figures and tell you in 30 seconds where the error was. She never talked about money at family dinners. That was her rule, one she held to with a consistency that struck me, even as a child, as deliberate. My father talked about money constantly, about his quarterly bonuses, about the neighbor's home renovation that was either showing off or sensible depending on the week, about Diane and Curtis's financial decisions, which he treated as a shared family project. Loretta sat at those dinners and ate her pot roast and nodded, and never said a word about her own finances, not once, not to anyone. On Saturday afternoons, from the time I was 8 years old until I left for Columbus at 18, my mother would drop me at Loretta's house while she ran errands or had coffee with church friends, and those Saturday afternoons were, looking back, the actual education of my life. Loretta and I would sit at her kitchen table with a game of cribbage between us, and she would talk. She talked about compound interest before I knew what compound interest was. She talked about the difference between spending money and deploying money. She talked about a woman's relationship to her own financial life as a matter of dignity, not luxury. You have to know what you have, she told me once, when I was maybe 11 years old. Not so you can spend it, so you can think. You can't think freely when you're always worried about money. That's by design. They want you worried. I asked her who they were. She smiled at her cribbage hand. Everyone who benefits from your not knowing your own worth. I didn't fully understand that until I was an adult, but it stayed in me, the way things stay when they're planted early. I want to ask you something, and I really want you to answer in the comments. Did you have someone like my grandmother Loretta? One person, in a house, on a Saturday afternoon, who talked to you like your brain was worth talking to, when everyone else in your family had already decided what you were and weren't capable of. Tell me who that person was. I think sometimes we don't say their names often enough. I graduated from Ohio State in 2005 with a degree in environmental engineering and a 3.7 GPA, which I did not tell my parents until after the ceremony, because I didn't want to spend the months beforehand managing their expectations in either direction. I got a job that August with an environmental consulting firm in Columbus called Terra Solutions Group, starting at $54,000 a year, and I moved into a one-bedroom apartment on the Near East Side of Columbus, and I began the work of building a life that, for the first time, had no one in it making me feel like an afterthought. Loretta died in November of 2009. She was 77 years old, and she had a stroke in her sleep, and when my mother called me at 6:30 on a Tuesday morning to tell me, I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time without being able to make myself stand up. She was the first person who had ever felt, to me, like a home. 6 weeks after her funeral, I got a phone call from a man named Warren Albright. He identified himself as a partner at a private wealth management firm in Cincinnati called Albright & Sato Financial. He said my name, checked that he had the right person, and then said, "Ms. Beaumont, your grandmother Loretta Sims named you the sole beneficiary of an investment trust she established in 1987. I'd like to schedule an appointment at your earliest convenience to discuss the details." I remember I was standing in my kitchen. I remember I was holding a spatula because I had been making eggs. I remember putting the spatula down very slowly on the counter and asking him to repeat what he had just said. The trust, which Loretta had established quietly through Warren Albright's predecessor at that firm when I was 5 years old, had been funded initially with $40,000, money she had saved over 20 years of careful, private discipline. For 22 years, under Warren Albright's management, it had been invested in a diversified portfolio of equities and bonds that Loretta had reviewed and approved every single year at an annual meeting she attended without telling anyone in her family she was attending. She had never touched the principal. She had reinvested every dividend and every return with the patience of someone who understood, at a molecular level, that time is the only financial resource that doesn't compound twice. When Loretta Sims died in November of 2009, that trust was worth $4.2 million. I sat across from Warren Albright 10 days later in his office in a building on 4th Street in downtown Cincinnati, and I looked at the statement he slid across his desk to me, and I could not speak for a long time. Warren Albright was a small, precise man of about 60, with reading glasses he wore on a chain around his neck, and he waited with a stillness that told me he had delivered news like this before and understood what it cost a person to absorb it. "Did my mother know?" I finally asked. "No," he said. "Your grandmother gave specific written instructions that the existence of this trust was to remain private and was not to be disclosed to any other family member under any circumstance. She amended those instructions in 2005 to include a note for you." He slid a sealed envelope across the desk. It had my name on it in Loretta's handwriting. Inside the envelope was a piece of paper torn from a yellow legal pad. Loretta's handwriting was very neat, even at the end. It said, "Simone, I am not leaving you this money so that you will be comfortable. I am leaving it to you so that you will be free. These are not the same thing. Be sure you understand the difference before you spend a dollar of it. I always saw you. I need you to know that." Grandma Loretta, I carried that piece of paper in my wallet for 3 years before I finally put it somewhere safer, somewhere it couldn't be worn down by the daily friction of just being carried around. I did not tell my parents. I want to explain this decision as clearly as I can, because I've spent 12 years examining it from every angle, and I still believe it was the right one, for reasons that have nothing to do with spite, even if spite was somewhere in the building. My father's relationship with money was profoundly proprietary. He believed that he understood the finances of everyone in his family, that it was, in some fundamental way, his business to understand them, that wealth within a family was a collective resource whose distribution reflected directly on his own judgment and management. If I had told him that my grandmother had left me $4.2 million, he would not have been able to let it simply be mine. He would have had opinions. He would have asked what I was doing with it, whether I had talked to someone trustworthy, whether I'd considered this or that. And behind all of those questions would have been the one he would never say out loud, but that lived in every interaction I'd ever had with my father. "Why you, instead of Diane?" My mother would have told Diane within 72 hours. I knew this the way I knew things about my family that I'd never been explicitly taught. By observation, by repetition, by the quiet accumulation of 23 years of watching how information moved through the Beaumont household. My mother was incapable of keeping anything that felt like news from my sister. It was not malice. It was just the structure of her love. Diane was the sun in that family's solar system, and information, like everything else, tended to orbit toward her. So I didn't tell them. Warren Albright was my financial advisor, then and now. I asked him, at our second meeting, whether he was comfortable being the only other person in the world who knew about this account. He looked at me steadily from behind his reading glasses and said, "Ms. Beaumont, I have been doing this for 30 years. I have never once violated a client's privacy. Your grandmother trusted me with a secret for 22 years. I consider that a professional record I have every intention of maintaining." I believed him. I still do. For the next 12 years, I lived two lives. In one life, I was a Columbus-based environmental engineer who rented an apartment and drove a sensible car and showed up at Christmas in Madeira with wine and gifts that said I was doing okay. Not spectacularly, just okay. In the other life, I was a woman who worked closely with Warren Albright on an investment portfolio that through the years between 2009 and 2021 grew steadily from $4.2 million into something considerably larger. I kept working. I want to be very clear about this. I kept working, not because I had to, but because the work was mine, in a way that nothing else felt quite as fully mine, and because leaving it would have changed something about who I was that I wasn't ready to change. I moved from Terra Solutions Group in 2012 to a senior engineer position at a firm called Pinnacle Environmental Consulting at $118,000 a year. I got licensed as a professional engineer in 2013. I led the environmental assessment for a $340 million industrial remediation project on the southern shore of Lake Erie in 2016, which brought me more professional recognition than anything I'd done before, and which my parents learned about at Christmas that year, because I mentioned it at the dinner table. My father asked me if the hours were hard on me. He then asked Diane if she'd seen the new restaurant that had opened near their house. I am not telling you this to make my father a villain. He was not a villain. He was a man of tremendous blind spots who believed, with complete sincerity, that he was a good father to both of his daughters, and I think the tragedy of him is not cruelty but limitation. The specific, preventable limitation of a person who decided very early what his children were and never found a reason to look again. In 2014, I met a man named David Esposito at a conference in Cleveland. He was a water infrastructure attorney, which sounds boring and is actually not, and we spent 3 hours at the hotel bar arguing about a piece of EPA regulation in a way that felt, to both of us, a lot like falling. We moved in together in 2015. We got married in a small ceremony in a botanical garden in Columbus in 2017, 10 people total, none of whom were my parents, because when I told them about the engagement, my mother's first response was to ask whether we'd considered waiting, since David was not, in her careful phrasing, someone the family knew. My parents did not come to the wedding. Diane did not come to the wedding. I did not explain this decision to anyone. I married my husband in a garden with our 10 closest people around us, and I have been, in the ways that matter most, entirely happy. My best friend since graduate school, a woman named Priya Vasquez, who is a civil engineer at the Columbus Department of Public Utilities, stood up next to me at that wedding and held my bouquet while I cried, and when she handed it back she whispered, "You deserve this, exactly this much," and I think that sentence did more for me than anything my parents had said to me in the preceding decade combined. Priya is one of 3 people who knew about Loretta's trust. The other 2 were David and Warren Albright. That was the whole list, for 12 years. My father died of complications from a cardiac procedure on March 14, 2021. He was at Christ Hospital in Cincinnati. The procedure was supposed to be routine. Afterward, he was not as stable as his cardiologist, a Dr. Annette Rosenberg, had expected, and 3 days later he was not there anymore. I drove to Cincinnati the morning he died, and I sat in a hospital waiting room that smelled like hand sanitizer and floor wax, and I held my mother's hand while she shook, and I want to tell you that what I felt in that room was grief. Real and uncomplicated grief. Not the tidy, relieved kind that people sometimes expect from children who have had difficult relationships with their parents. I grieved my father with a rawness that surprised me. I think I was grieving less the father he had been, and more the father I had always, at some level, kept waiting for him to become. Diane organized the funeral. She organized everything. She was, in that period, genuinely magnificent in the way that some people become their most competent selves in a crisis, and I watched her manage the church, the caterers, the burial arrangements, the out-of-town relatives who needed to be accommodated, all of it, with an efficiency that I respected completely. We did not talk much during those days. We moved around each other in our parents' house with the careful courtesy of two people who have never quite figured out the right distance. My mother's health declined steadily after my father died. She had mild cognitive impairment that her doctor at the University of Cincinnati Health had been tracking since 2019, and the grief accelerated it in ways that were painful and not especially slow. By the fall of 2021, she was not safe on her own. Diane and Curtis moved her into their home in Madeira. Diane became her primary caretaker. I drove down from Columbus once or twice a month, and I sat with my mother in the guest room that had become hers, and sometimes she was sharp, and sometimes she was somewhere else, and either way I sat there, and I held her hand, and I told her about the latest remediation project, or about what David had cooked for dinner the night before. Small, ordinary things that seemed to reach her even when larger ones didn't. She died in July of 2022. Fast. The way her own mother had gone fast, the heart announcing without negotiation that it was finished. Diane called me at 7 in the morning, and her voice was so flat with exhaustion that she sounded like a recording of herself. I drove to Cincinnati and we spent 3 days doing together what she had largely organized alone for my father, and this time I helped more, and we moved around each other in the house with something that was not yet closeness, but was not coldness either. Something in between, something that hadn't been named yet. Donald Kessler, the probate attorney, read the will 6 weeks later. I already told you how that went. $2,000, and gratitude for my years of independence. I sat in that chair across from him, and I did not cry, and I did not say anything I couldn't take back, and afterward I walked to the parking garage on Race Street alone, and I sat in my car for 25 minutes, and I let myself feel every bit of it. Not the money, because I had never needed the money, but the message. The intentional, considered, legally formalized message that my parents had arranged at some point before their health declined to send me from beyond death. You were on your own, and we are confirming it in writing. I have to ask you something here, because I think a lot of you know exactly what I'm describing. Has your family ever done something that didn't hurt you financially, that maybe didn't even hurt you practically at all, but that confirmed something you'd been trying not to believe for your entire life? Not the thing they did, the confirmation. The proof that you hadn't been imagining it. Tell me about it in the comments, because sitting in that parking garage in Cincinnati, what broke me wasn't $2,000. It was the end of the long argument with myself about whether I'd been seeing my own family clearly. I drove back to Columbus. I did not call Diane. I called David, and then I called Priya, and then I called Warren Albright, and I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of water I couldn't drink, and I thought about Loretta Sims on Orchard Street, and her legal pad, and the word free. 3 months passed. I went back to work. David took me to dinner at a restaurant called The Rigsby on East Long Street, and ordered a bottle of wine that cost more than I'd spent on groceries for a month and said, "You are allowed to be angry. You are allowed to be as angry as this actually makes you." And I said I knew that, and then I ordered the steak and didn't talk about it for the rest of the dinner, which is a thing David understands about me, that sometimes I need to put something down before I can pick it back up cleanly. In December of 2022, Warren Albright called me with the annual portfolio review. He summarized the year's performance, which had been mixed because 2022 was a rough year for equities generally, and he gave me the end-of-year total. I had not looked at the statement in several months, which I sometimes do on purpose. There is a version of watching money too closely that starts to feel like a personality you don't want to have. The end-of-year total was $27,400,000. I wrote it down on a post-it note while Warren Albright was still talking. $27,400,000. I folded the post-it and put it in the drawer of my desk, where I also kept Loretta's legal pad note. I sat with those two pieces of paper for a long time after I got off the phone. $2,000, $27,400,000, 6 inches apart in a desk drawer in Columbus, Ohio, the whole story, in 2 numbers. The reversal in my story did not happen the way reversals happen in movies. There was no courtroom. There was no family dinner where I stood up and announced something while everyone gasped. What happened was this. In January of 2023, 7 months after my mother's will was read, Diane called me on a Sunday afternoon, which was unusual enough that I picked up on the first ring. She had been going through our mother's things, she said. Boxes of papers, mostly. My mother had kept everything, the way people from certain generations keep everything, as though the paper itself is the proof that something happened. And in a shoebox in the top shelf of the guest room closet, Diane had found a letter. A handwritten letter in an envelope addressed to my mother, postmarked October 2008, in Loretta Sims's handwriting. Diane read me the letter over the phone. I am going to tell you what it said, because I have memorized it word by word since the day I first heard it, and because it explains everything about my grandmother that I have spent 12 years only partially understanding. The letter said, "Gloria, I am writing this because I want you to know something I should have said out loud a long time ago, and because I am not always brave enough to say difficult things to your face without retreating. You have 2 daughters. You treat one of them like she is the point of your family, and one of them like she is the footnote. I know you love Simone. I know you think you are doing right by her. I am telling you, as your mother, that you are not. That child is the most remarkable person in your family, and she has been trying to get you to see it since she was old enough to understand that you were looking the other way. I am not going to tell you what to do about that. You're a grown woman, but I am going to tell you that I have made arrangements, privately, to see to it that Simone has what she needs to live a life worthy of what she actually is. I have been building that for 20 years. I owe you no apology for it, and I am not offering one. I love you, Gloria, but I am not going to watch that child be made small any longer without doing something about it. Mom V." The letter had been opened and refolded many times. The creases were soft, the way creases go soft when a piece of paper has been unfolded and refolded so many times that the fibers themselves have submitted to the habit. My mother had read that letter over and over again for 13 years, and she had never said a word about it. Not to Loretta, not to me, not, apparently, to anyone. Diane was silent on the other end of the phone for a very long time after she finished reading. Then she said, "Simone, did Grandma leave you money?" I told her the truth, all of it. The phone call from Warren Albright in 2009, the trust, the $4.2 million, and what it had grown into. The post-it note in my desk drawer, and the number on it. I did not soften any of it. I told it the way Loretta would have told it. Precisely, clearly, without apology, because the truth doesn't benefit from decoration. Diane didn't speak for so long that I said her name twice to make sure the call hadn't dropped. When she finally spoke, what she said was, "I don't know whether to be happy for you or furious at everyone. I've spent a lot of time doing both," I said. She said, "Why didn't you tell us?" I said, "Because Grandma Loretta asked me not to, and because I knew what would happen if I did. Mom would have told you within 3 days, and then it would have become a family conversation, and the one thing in my life that was entirely mine would have had 12 opinions attached to it before the month was out." Diane was quiet again. Then she said something I wasn't expecting. She said, "I owe you an apology." I asked her what she meant. She said, I knew. Not about the money. I didn't know about the money, but I knew that mom and dad treated you differently. I knew it when we were kids, and I didn't say anything. And I think I didn't say anything because I was afraid that if I brought it up, they'd start treating me the same way. I was 16 years old and I made a calculation, and I chose to protect myself, and I've thought about it for 25 years. I'm sorry, Simone. I'm really sorry. I want you to hear that, because I think it is one of the most honest things anyone in my family has ever said to me. Diane was 46 years old when she said it, sitting alone in our dead parents' house, surrounded by boxes and shoebox letters, and she said it clearly, without asking me to make it easier for her. I gave her credit for that. I give her credit for it every time I think about it. We talked for almost 3 hours that afternoon. She told me things I hadn't known, that our father had once told her, when she was 22, and Diane had mentioned that she thought maybe I was smarter than people gave me credit for, that some people were book smart, and some people had practical intelligence, and it didn't always come out even, and she'd understood immediately that he was talking about me and that she was not supposed to push back on it. She told me our mother had once told her, the year I got my PE license, that she wasn't sure I'd made the right career choice, that engineering was a hard field for women, and she worried. She never told you that, Diane said. She never said anything to you about the license, but she talked to me about worrying. That's a particular kind of erasure, being discussed behind your back as a problem to be managed while your face is being given a smile. I told her about my wedding. I told her that David and I had gotten married in 2017, and that we hadn't invited them because of the response to our engagement, and I told her I still didn't know whether that was the right call, but that I'd stopped apologizing for it, to myself, at least. Diane cried. Not performatively, quietly, in a way that sounded like she was trying not to. She said, I would have come. I want you to know that, if you had called me separately, I would have come. I believed her. I don't know if it changes anything. I've decided that it doesn't have to either change everything or change nothing. It can just be something true that I hold. Here is where I need to ask you something directly, because I've thought about this question more than almost any other question my life has handed me. If someone in your family finally apologizes, really apologizes, without excuses, without asking you to forgive them in the same breath, what do you do with that? Not the apology itself, but the years before it, the years that the apology is sitting on top of. Tell me in the comments. I am genuinely asking, because I am still working this out. In the months that followed, Diane and I did something we had not done since we were children, in a way that had not been managed for us. We talked. Not about our parents, not to process them, we'd done enough of that on the phone, but about ourselves. She told me about the particular loneliness of being the good one, the one everyone assumed was fine, the one whose difficulties went unnoticed because she had learned very young to perform okayness as a survival skill. She told me her marriage to Curtis was good, but that she'd been in therapy for 2 years, working through something she described as a deep, unspecific anxiety that she'd eventually come to understand as the lifelong fear that she would stop being good enough and everyone would finally stop pretending to love her. She told me she'd envied me, sometimes, in a way she'd never admitted. You got out, she said. You built something over there in Columbus that had nothing to do with Sunday dinners. I used to drive home from mom and dad's on Sunday nights and think, how did Simone know to leave and why didn't I figure out the same thing? I did not know how to tell her that leaving had not felt like a strategy. It had felt like survival. It had felt like the only direction in which I could breathe. I told her about Loretta's Saturday afternoons, about the cribbage table and the compound interest and they want you worried. I told her that what Loretta had given me was not, at its root, $27 million. What she had given me was a model of a woman who understood her own financial life as a form of dignity and freedom, who had treated money not as a status signal or a social score, but as a tool for thinking clearly about your own future. She was teaching me, I said. She didn't call it that. She just sat across a cribbage table and talked to me like I was a person worth investing ideas in. And I think everything that came after, the engineering degree, the career, the trust, all of it, started in her kitchen on Saturday afternoons. Diane said quietly, "She never did that with me." I said, "I know. And I don't know why she made the choices she made. I don't know why she chose me specifically. But I've thought about it a lot, and I think it was less about me, and more about what she saw happening to me. I think she watched the family treat me as less than from the time I was very small, and she made a decision, privately, without any drama, that she was going to correct that balance as completely as she could within the limits of what she could control. In March of 2023, I set up two things. The first was a meeting between Diane and Warren Albright. Not to give her money, nothing about Loretta's trust was ever going to Diane, because that had not been Loretta's wish, and I did not have the right to reinterpret a dead woman's love into something it wasn't. But Diane wanted to understand. She wanted to sit across from the man who had managed a $40,000 initial investment into $27 million over 35 years and understand, mechanically, how that had been done, because she realized, at 46, with her own retirement account underfunded and her own financial life largely deferred to Curtis, that she had never once been taught what my grandmother had been trying to teach me, and she wanted to start. I sat in that meeting with her. Warren Albright took us through the whole history, the 1987 portfolio construction, the rebalancing strategy, the decades of reinvestment. Diane took notes on a legal pad. When we walked out of the building onto 4th Street, she stopped on the sidewalk and looked at me and said, "I feel like I missed an entire education." "You did," I said. "So did I. Partly. But it's not too late." The second thing I set up was a college fund for my sister's kids. Diane has two daughters, Mara, who is 17, and Josephine, who is 14. I funded the 529s for both of them. $400,000 total, split equally, enough that neither girl will graduate with student loans if they choose to go to college, which I hope they do, but which I have told Diane explicitly is not a condition. The money is theirs without strings. I told Diane it was not about the inheritance. It was about a pattern I wanted to interrupt, the pattern of girls in our family being kept financially uncertain by the people who were supposed to be building them up, being kept in a position of having to depend on the right relationships and the right choices and the right graces rather than their own accumulated capability. I was not willing to let that pattern reach into the next generation without doing something about it, if I had the means to do something about it. Diane cried again. She is a crier, which I have come to understand is not weakness but honesty. She cries when something is true and important, and I have started to find it reliable. We are still rebuilding. I want to be honest about this, because I think these stories sometimes end in a way that makes it sound like the hard part is all behind you, and that is not where I am. Diane and I talk on the phone every 2 weeks. We have visited each other 3 times this year, twice in Madeira and once in Columbus, where Diane and Mara came up for a weekend, and David cooked dinner, and we sat on our back porch until midnight, talking about everything and nothing, the kind of easy, expanding conversation that I thought, for a long time, I would never have with anyone from my original family. It is not easy in the way that relationships are easy when they've never been broken. It is easy the way a repaired thing is easy. You can use it. It holds, but you know where the seam is. My parents' house on Fenwick Drive sold in the fall of 2023. Diane used the money to pay off the remainder of her mortgage and put the rest in an investment account Warren Albright helped her set up. She sends me a screenshot of the balance every quarter with a note that just says Grandma Loretta would be pleased. I send back a heart and a cribbage hand emoji. It is a small thing. It is ours. The $1 check from my parents' estate sat in a drawer for 6 months. I deposited it eventually, not out of need, not even out of spite, but because Loretta Sims told me that money should be put to use, rather than left sitting still on a principle that only you can see. I put the $2. After the bank's deposit, $1 becomes $2 in your account. I've always thought that was a funny thing about bank deposits. I put the $2 toward a donation I make every year to an environmental education program at Columbus City Schools that teaches middle schoolers about water systems and climate science. It is a small program with a good coordinator named Felicia Brandt, who sends me a card every December with a drawing one of her students made of a watershed. I keep the drawings on the bulletin board in my office next to my PE license. I think about Loretta Sims most mornings, not mournfully, just the way you think about someone who shaped the fundamental structure of your life. I think about her in her kitchen on Orchard Street, unhurried, clear-eyed, building something enormous out of patience and arithmetic and the specific, unshowy kind of love that doesn't announce itself. She did not rescue me. I want to be clear about that. I rescued myself, with the work and the years and the decisions and the incredible luck of marrying a man who looked at me clearly from the beginning. But she gave me something without which rescue would not have been possible. She gave me, before I was old enough to understand I needed it, proof that someone looked at me and decided I was worth the investment. Not because I was easy, not because I fit what the family had decided I should be, because she could see, from wherever grandmothers see from, what I actually was. My parents left my sister the house, and the money, and everything else they had to give. They left me $2,000 and a line about my independence that I suspect was written by their lawyer, because nobody in my family could have generated that sentence on their own. They did not know about the $27 million sitting in a brokerage account at Albright and Sato. They did not know that the difficult daughter, the B student, the one who switched her major and didn't come home for Sunday dinners and got married in a garden without them, had been seen and chosen, and quietly, patiently, systematically provided for by the one woman in the family who understood that love without material evidence is sometimes just a feeling that the person receiving it has no way to hold on to. I am not angry anymore. I want to say that carefully, because I don't mean it in the way that people sometimes say they are not angry, as a way of being more credibly angry. I mean it in the way of someone who has sat with a thing long enough that it has changed shape. The anger was real. It was appropriate. It was earned by years of being the footnote in my own family's story, and I don't feel any need to have never felt it. But it did its work and it moved on, and what it left behind is not bitterness and not sweetness either. It is something more like clarity. I know what my parents were. I know what they weren't. I know what my grandmother saw. I know who I built, mostly by myself, out of good luck and good stubbornness, and Saturday afternoons at a cribbage table with a woman who talked to me like my brain was worth talking to. I am sitting in my office in Columbus, Ohio. The thunderstorm I mentioned at the beginning has arrived, and the rain is coming down hard against the window, and on my bulletin board there is a student drawing of a watershed and a picture of my husband and me at the Columbus Marathon finish line 2 years ago. And on the shelf above my desk there is a small framed photograph of Loretta Sims on her front porch in Loveland, taken in the summer of 1994, squinting pleasantly into the sun, with the expression of a woman who had already made all the important decisions and was simply waiting, with interest, to see how they turned out. If you've made it here, if you've sat with this story from the beginning to the end of it, I want to ask you one last thing. Not about money, and not about families necessarily. I want to ask you, who saw you before you could fully see yourself? Who was the person who made a decision, privately, quietly, without making a performance of it, that you were worth investing in? Tell me in the comments. Say their name if you feel like it. I think the people who do that for us deserve to be named, even if they're gone, especially if they're gone. And if you want more stories like mine, there is a link in the description to another one I think you'll stay up late reading. Thank you for being here.